A newborn discovered lifeless in an airport restroom, a mother vanishing into the crowd, and a mystery buried for 17 years. This is not just a crime. It's a haunting journey through silence, science, and truth. Stay with us, because every moment brings you closer to shocking answers. On a warm October afternoon in 2005, the steady hum of travelers at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport carried on as usual. Families bustled to their gates, business professionals hurried past security lines, and tourists snapped quick photos before boarding. Amid this ordinary scene, inside the walls of Terminal 4, a discovery was about to unravel a story that would haunt the city for nearly 2 decades. In the women's restroom, tucked behind the noise and rush of passengers, a janitorial crew moved through their routine. What began as another shift of sweeping floors and emptying trash bins suddenly turned into a chilling confrontation with death. When the cleaner lifted the lid of a trash container, she recoiled in horror. Inside, wrapped crudely in paper towels, was the tiny, motionless body of a newborn baby girl. For a moment, disbelief paralyzed her. She called for her colleague, and soon, the restroom filled with a panicked silence, interrupted only by the sound of someone fumbling to contact airport security. Within minutes, Phoenix police and paramedics arrived, but it was too late. The infant had no pulse, no breath, no chance. She had been born into the world only to be suffocated and abandoned in the first hours of her life. Authorities would later give her a name, Baby Skylar. The name was not chosen by blood relatives, but by the investigators and members of the public who mourned her. To many, it was important that this child, robbed of dignity at birth, at least be remembered with an identity, however symbolic. The police secured the restroom, collected the trash bin as evidence, and began a search for answers. Who had left the child there? Was the mother still in the airport? Did she intend to board a flight, disappearing into anonymity while her child remained behind? The airport was placed under a quiet but urgent investigation. Surveillance footage was combed through, and security officers watched hours of tapes, scanning for a woman who might have shown signs of distress or entered the restroom pregnant and left without a baby. But thousands of passengers passed through Sky Harbor every day, and the task was monumental. The video was blurry in certain sections, the angles obstructed. Nothing provided a clear lead. Meanwhile, the medical examiner confirmed the cause of death: suffocation. Baby Skylar had been born alive, her lungs showing evidence of breath, but her life was deliberately ended. The revelation shifted the investigation from a case of possible abandonment to one of homicide. Detectives faced a wall of silence. No woman came forward. No passenger reported seeing or hearing a newborn cry inside the restroom. It was as if the birth and death had occurred invisibly, in plain sight, yet unnoticed by all. News of the discovery spread quickly through local and national media. Headlines carried the image of the airport, its recognizable runways and terminals, now shadowed by tragedy. Reporters highlighted the cruelty of discarding a life in a trash bin, and the public reacted with outrage and grief. Community members began leaving flowers and stuffed animals at the gates of the airport. A vigil was held, and mourners who had never known the child prayed for her soul. The name Skylar was whispered as a symbol of innocence, of a life that deserved more than abandonment. For Phoenix police, the case was a priority, but soon, frustration set in. Without witnesses, without a confession, and with only limited DNA evidence, the trail grew cold. Investigators collected biological material from the baby's body and the surrounding items in the trash, preserving what they could. But in 2005, forensic technology was still limited. Databases were not as vast as they are today, and genetic genealogy was far from being a standard tool in criminal investigations. Detectives could do little beyond storing the evidence, waiting for the day science might advance enough to unlock the truth. While investigators struggled, the community debated the circumstances. Some believed the mother had acted out of desperation and fear, perhaps a young woman hiding a pregnancy from her family or afraid of stigma. Others saw the act as deliberate and cruel, a conscious choice to end a life rather than seek help. What stood out most to advocates and officials was the painful irony. Arizona had safe haven laws in place by 2005. These laws allowed mothers to surrender newborns at hospitals, fire stations, or designated safe sites with complete anonymity and no legal consequences. Had the mother chosen that path, baby Skylar might have been placed in foster care or adopted into a family willing to give her the life she deserved. Years passed, and the story of baby Skylar slipped from headlines but never disappeared from memory. For the detectives who had worked the case, the image of the small infant in a trash bin remained etched in their minds. For the janitors who found her, the trauma of that day lingered. And for the public, the unanswered question, who was the mother, and why did she do it, was a wound without closure. The child was laid to rest in Phoenix, her burial funded by community donations. Strangers attended the ceremony, some bringing flowers, others carrying only the heavy silence of grief. She had no family by her side, no mother or father to weep over her grave, but the people of Phoenix gave her a farewell. In their eyes, baby Skylar became more than a case file. She became a symbol of compassion, a reminder of society's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable. Behind the scenes, the evidence sat in storage, waiting for a future moment when technology might offer answers. Detectives moved on to other cases, but each year, when anniversaries of the discovery surfaced, baby Skylar's file was quietly revisited. Forensic scientists preserved the DNA carefully, knowing it could one day speak when humans could not. What no one knew in 2005 was that the wait for justice would last nearly 17 years. The young mother who had abandoned her baby that October afternoon would go on with her life, never identified, never questioned, until the moment science and persistence finally caught up with her. The story of baby Skylar was far from over. The tragedy that began in a restroom at one of America's busiest airports was the beginning of a mystery that demanded resolution. And though years stretched on without answers, the determination of investigators and the march of scientific progress would eventually bring the truth into light. As the years passed after that October day in 2005, the image of baby Skylar resting in a trash bin never truly faded from the memories of those who had seen her case firsthand. For Phoenix police, it became one of those haunting files stored deep within the cold case archives, marked by tragedy and a lack of resolution. Detectives who had worked the initial investigation moved on to other assignments, some retiring, some shifting to new roles, yet the memory of that infant stayed with them. The janitorial staff who discovered her body carried their own form of trauma, recalling how the ordinary routine of their work had turned into an unimaginable horror. For the public, the baby was remembered each year in whispers, vigils, and quiet conversations, her story resurfacing in articles that labeled her a forgotten child. But technology was not standing still. Forensic science was evolving in ways investigators in 2005 could only have imagined. The field of DNA testing, once limited in scope, expanded into something far more powerful with the advent of genetic genealogy. In the early 2010s, cases once considered unsolvable began finding resolution as cold case units across the country turned to new methods of extracting familial links from DNA evidence. The breakthrough use of genealogy in identifying the Golden State Killer in 2018 showed the world that science could breathe life back into cold files. That same spark of hope lit up the Phoenix Police Department, and for the detectives who remembered baby Skylar, the question resurfaced. Could this technology finally identify the mother who had abandoned her? Inside the evidence storage facility, the samples collected in 2005 had been kept secure, shielded from contamination and preserved for the future. Technicians retrieved the DNA swabs taken from the infant's body and surrounding items in the restroom trash bin. They submitted the material to a specialized laboratory capable of extracting and sequencing genetic profiles. Once the data was processed, it was compared against genealogy databases, where millions of individuals had voluntarily uploaded their DNA information to trace ancestry, find relatives, or build family trees. This growing reservoir of genetic data had already solved homicides, rapes, and disappearances. It was about to shine a light on a baby girl who had been left behind at an airport nearly 2 decades earlier. The results were not immediate. Genealogists pored over partial matches, distant cousins, and fragmented family trees, piecing together a puzzle with painstaking care. Every strand of DNA pointed to branches of a family that stretched across different states. But slowly, methodically, the circle narrowed. By 2022, the breakthrough finally arrived. The evidence traced back to one woman, Annie Anderson. She had been a teenager at the time of the crime, someone young enough to conceal a pregnancy, terrified enough to carry a secret to one of the busiest airports in the country. Now, as an adult, she was living an ordinary life, never expecting her past to resurface. When detectives approached her, they did not reveal the full extent of their findings at first. Instead, they sought answers. Anderson initially denied any involvement, claiming no memory or connection to the case. But DNA evidence is a truth that cannot be erased. The genetic match was conclusive. She was the biological mother of baby Skylar. Detectives explained how the genealogy had led them to her, how 17 years of silence had finally ended. With that revelation, the walls of denial began to close in. News of the identification sent ripples through the community. For those who had mourned the baby years ago, the revelation that the mother had been found reignited emotions buried deep. Some reacted with anger, insisting that justice must be served for the deliberate suffocation of a helpless child. Others expressed sorrow, imagining the desperation and fear that might have driven a young woman to such an act. Yet the law had little room for sympathy. Prosecutors prepared charges of first-degree murder, citing the medical examiner's original determination that the baby had been born alive and intentionally killed. The courtroom process ahead promised to be grueling. The defense was expected to argue that Anderson had acted in panic, without premeditation, and that her youth and isolation should be taken into account. The prosecution, however, emphasized the brutality of the act. Safe haven laws had existed at the time. Options were available. Instead, a conscious choice was made to suffocate a newborn and leave her in a bin. To them, the case was clear. This was not abandonment, this was homicide. As reporters revisited the story, images of Sky Harbor International Airport returned to national television. The footage of crowded terminals was contrasted with the solemn reminders of the child's discovery years earlier. Journalists interviewed former investigators, airport staff, and members of the public who had attended baby Skylar's funeral. Many spoke with relief that the mother had finally been found, though the pain of the loss had never truly healed. Meanwhile, detectives who had preserved the evidence reflected on the role of persistence. One retired officer admitted that he had long feared baby Skylar's case would never be solved. He recalled standing at her grave during her community-funded funeral, promising that someone would one day be held accountable. To him, the DNA match was not just a scientific victory, it was the fulfillment of a vow. At the heart of the renewed attention, though, was the child herself. Reporters reminded audiences that baby Skylar had no chance to live a life, to take her first steps, to speak her first words. She was denied even the dignity of being claimed by her own mother. Instead, strangers had named her, buried her, and carried her memory. For them, the identification of Annie Anderson was not only a matter of justice, but also an acknowledgement that Skylar had not been forgotten. The case also reignited conversations about safe haven laws. Advocates stressed that such tragedies could be prevented if awareness campaigns reached vulnerable women. By 2005, Arizona had protections in place that could have saved Skylar's life. Yet awareness was often lacking, and fear or shame could push young mothers into desperate acts. In the wake of the identification, public officials renewed efforts to educate communities, ensuring that no child should ever again be abandoned to such a fate. Annie Anderson's arrest marked a turning point in a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 17 years. Yet the story was not over. The legal battle ahead would determine how the justice system would weigh the actions of a frightened teenager against the deliberate killing of a newborn. The nation watched, waiting to see whether the verdict would provide closure, or whether the haunting questions surrounding baby Skylar's death would linger still. When Annie Anderson was finally brought before the court, the case of baby Skylar re-entered the public consciousness with the weight of 17 years of unanswered questions pressing down on every word. The courtroom became a stage where the tragedy of 2005 was relived in excruciating detail. Prosecutors presented the narrative of a young woman who had secretly carried a pregnancy, delivered her child in a public restroom, and made the conscious choice to end that baby's life. They emphasized the cruelty of the act, showing jurors how Skylar had been born alive, her lungs filled with the first breaths of air, only to be suffocated within minutes. The defense countered with a different portrayal. A terrified teenager, isolated and overwhelmed, who panicked in the midst of labor, unable to process the enormity of the moment. Their argument rested not on denying the act, but on reframing it as an act of desperation rather than premeditated murder. Witnesses took the stand, recounting the original discovery of the baby in 2005. The janitorial staff who had found her body described the shock that rippled through them that day, the silence in the restroom broken by their disbelief and grief. Investigators spoke about the painstaking collection of evidence, the frustration of stalled leads, and the determination that drove them to preserve the DNA for future testing. Forensic experts explained how genealogy databases, once used only for ancestry tracing, had become tools for justice, guiding detectives step by step until the truth pointed directly at Anderson. Each testimony served as a reminder that the child at the heart of the case was more than a statistic. She was a life lost. Outside the courtroom, emotions ran high. Protesters gathered, some demanding the harshest punishment possible, others holding signs that pleaded for compassion, arguing that Anderson's youth at the time should not be ignored. News cameras broadcast the divided public sentiment. On one side, cries for justice for Skylar. On the other, voices insisting that society had failed a young woman who felt she had no options. Commentators on television revisited the topic of safe haven laws, pointing out that Arizona's protections had been in place even in 2005, yet the awareness of those laws had not reached everyone who needed them. The tragedy became a rallying point for advocates who wanted stronger campaigns to educate the public, so that no mother would ever again feel cornered into such a desperate decision. As the trial progressed, the jury was forced to confront uncomfortable questions. Could a frightened teenager truly comprehend the permanence of her actions? Did panic absolve her of responsibility, or did it merely explain the motive? The prosecutors reminded them that the law recognized the difference between abandonment and homicide, and that Skylar had not been left in hopes of survival but had been actively deprived of life. The defense urged the jury to consider the human side of fear and secrecy, asking them to see Annie not as a monster but as a girl who made a tragic mistake in the darkest moment of her life. The verdict, when it came, carried with it the weight of 17 years of silence. Anderson was convicted, though the precise degree of her sentence reflected the complexity of the case. For the community, the decision was a form of closure, a legal acknowledgement that baby Skylar's life mattered and that her death was not forgotten. Yet even as the gavel fell, the story remained far more than a criminal file. It was a societal mirror, reflecting failures, fears, and the fragile balance between justice and compassion. For those who had carried the memory of Skylar, the resolution brought a bittersweet relief. Retired detectives who had long feared the case would remain unsolved spoke about the sense of fulfillment, that their promise to the infant had finally been honored. Members of the public who had attended her funeral all those years ago visited her grave once more, leaving flowers in acknowledgement that justice had, at last, found its way. But alongside the relief was sorrow. Sorrow for the life that could never be reclaimed, for the milestone Skylar would never reach, and for the knowledge that her mother had been the one to end her life. The legacy of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. Arizona officials renewed campaigns to increase public awareness of safe haven laws, distributing information to schools, health clinics, and airports. Nonprofits dedicated to supporting young mothers used Skylar's story as a teaching point, reminding people that options existed even in the most desperate circumstances. Across the country, her name became part of broader conversations about how society addresses unwanted pregnancies, stigma, and the hidden struggles of young women. For forensic science, the case stood as yet another example of how genetic genealogy had transformed the pursuit of justice. Baby Skylar's identification underscored the importance of preserving evidence, even when immediate answers seemed impossible. What was once a cold file had been resurrected by science, proving that time does not always erase truth, it only delays its revelation. Law enforcement agencies across the nation cited the case when advocating for expanded resources to reopen cold cases, knowing that countless other victims waited in silence for their stories to be told. In the quiet moments after the trial, the story returned to where it had begun. To a baby born in the shadows of an airport restroom, her life extinguished before it had the chance to begin. Though her name was given by strangers, though her funeral was attended by those who had never met her, she became a symbol that endured for nearly 2 decades. In her short existence, and in the tragedy of her death, she forced a city and a nation to confront questions of morality, justice, and compassion. The final chapter of baby Skylar's story is not only about the conviction of her mother, but also about the way her memory reshaped laws, inspired advocacy, and highlighted the power of science to restore forgotten voices. She remains a reminder that even the smallest life carries meaning, and that justice, though delayed, can still arrive with clarity and force. For Phoenix, the case will forever stand as one of its most haunting tragedies. For the world, it is a testament to how a newborn abandoned in silence could speak louder in death than anyone ever imagined. A quiet pond in suburban Australia hides a chilling secret, a suitcase carrying the lifeless body of 2-year-old Dean Shillingsworth. What drove a mother to commit the unthinkable, and how did the system fail him? This is the haunting story you cannot look away from. In October 2007, a seemingly ordinary day in Ambarvale, a quiet suburb near Campbelltown in New South Wales, turned into a haunting moment that would grip the entire nation. 2 local fishermen, spending their afternoon by a pond in the area, noticed something unusual floating in the still water. At first glance, it appeared to be just an abandoned suitcase, perhaps dumped carelessly as rubbish. But the odd weight of it, and the eerie way it bobbed on the surface, drew their curiosity. When authorities arrived and retrieved it, the grisly truth was revealed. Inside was the decomposed body of a little boy. Australia would soon come to know his name. Dean Shillingsworth, a toddler whose life had been cut tragically short in the most brutal of circumstances. The discovery sparked an immediate wave of disbelief and sorrow. Communities across the country, from big cities to small towns, reacted with horror as news bulletins described the child's body hidden away in a suitcase, discarded like something worthless. It was an image almost too painful to imagine, and it pierced through the conscience of the public. Who could have done something so unthinkable? Who was this child, and why had his life ended so violently? The answers, when they came, would only deepen the sense of outrage and grief. Dean had been born in 2005, a bright-eyed little boy whose future should have held laughter, learning, and the comfort of a loving home. But his short life was marked by instability. His mother, Rachel Fitzner, carried a troubled past into her parenting. She was young, already burdened by personal struggles, including substance abuse and rocky relationships. Accounts from those who knew her painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by her circumstances, often disconnected from the responsibilities of caring for a child. Despite this, Dean remained in her custody, a decision that in hindsight raised unsettling questions about whether the system had failed him. On the other side of his family was his father, Jason Shillingsworth. Jason came from an Aboriginal community in western New South Wales and by many accounts had a steadier presence than Rachel. Though he did not have custody of Dean, relatives and friends later spoke of his deep love for the boy. Jason longed to be a more active father, but custody arrangements and distance meant that Dean's life was largely shaped by his mother's unstable environment. When Jason eventually learned of his son's death, his grief was compounded by the knowledge that he had not been able to protect him. As police pieced together the details, the evidence led quickly to Rachel. Dean had last been seen with her, and her movements in the days leading up to the discovery raised suspicions. The police interrogations revealed inconsistencies in her accounts, and eventually, under the weight of mounting evidence, she confessed. What came out of that confession was devastating. In a fit of anger and frustration, she had strangled her 2-year-old son. The suitcase in the pond was her desperate attempt to cover up a crime that could not possibly be hidden. The brutality of Rachel's actions shook even seasoned investigators. Cases of child abuse were, tragically, not unheard of, But the image of a mother killing her toddler and discarding him in such a cold manner seemed almost beyond comprehension. For the public, the betrayal ran even deeper. A mother is expected to be the ultimate protector, the person who shields a child from the dangers of the world. In Dean's case, the greatest danger had come from the very person who should have kept him safe. In the aftermath of the discovery, Dean's extended family and community were plunged into mourning. Candlelight vigils were held, with members of the Aboriginal community and the wider public coming together to grieve for the little boy whose life had been stolen. People who had never met Dean wept for him, leaving flowers, toys, and handwritten notes near the site of the pond. His death became more than just a family tragedy. It was a national wound, exposing both the fragility of childhood and the failures of systems meant to protect vulnerable children. At the same time, the story of Rachel's background began to surface in news reports and courtroom testimonies. She was portrayed as a woman with a long history of personal struggles, drug use, unstable housing, and fraught relationships with partners and family. Some accounts suggested that she felt trapped by the pressures of raising young children without the stability or support she needed. Yet, while her life was undeniably difficult, the act she committed went beyond hardship into the realm of cruelty. The court and the public were left to wrestle with the uncomfortable balance between understanding her circumstances and condemning her actions. The case also drew attention to the broader issue of child protection services. Relatives and members of the community revealed that concerns about Dean's safety had been raised long before his death. There had been opportunities, some argued, for authorities to intervene, to remove him from an environment that was clearly unstable. Why had those warnings not been acted upon? Why was a little boy left in harm's way until it was too late? These questions ignited a national conversation about accountability, oversight, and the urgent need to strengthen systems that were meant to safeguard children. As the days turned into weeks, the trial loomed ahead. The image of Dean in the suitcase continued to haunt the public imagination. For many, it was not just a case of murder. It was a symbol of innocence betrayed in the most horrific way. In the courtroom, prosecutors laid out the evidence, detailing Rachel's confession and the chilling steps she had taken to conceal the crime. The defense painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by her life, struggling with mental health and addiction, but such arguments could not erase the fact that a young boy had been murdered. Part 1 of Dean's story ends with the weight of unanswered questions hanging heavy in the air. A community was left reeling, a father was left shattered, and an entire nation was left asking how such a tragedy could have been allowed to happen. The discovery of Dean's body marked the beginning of a painful journey through grief, anger, and the pursuit of justice. What lay ahead would expose not only the details of the crime but also the deeper failures and fractures within the system that should have protected him. As the investigation moved forward, the story of Dean Shillingsworth's death deepened into something even more disturbing. Detectives retraced the days leading up to the discovery of the suitcase, speaking to neighbors, friends, and relatives of Rachel Fitzner to piece together the chain of events. What emerged was the portrait of a young mother unraveling under the weight of her circumstances, lashing out in moments of frustration that would culminate in an irreversible act. Witnesses described Rachel's erratic behavior in the days before Dean was killed. She was seen carrying the small boy, sometimes looking detached or distant, at other times showing visible anger. There were accounts of her being agitated, short-tempered, and struggling to cope with the demands of raising multiple children. It was in this state, authorities concluded, that she turned on her son in a fit of rage and strangled him. Once Dean was dead, Rachel's actions only added to the horror. Instead of seeking help or acknowledging what she had done, she placed his tiny body inside a suitcase and took it to a pond in Ambarvale. The act of discarding him there, hidden beneath the water, became one of the most chilling elements of the case. It suggested not only violence but also an attempt to erase his existence, to hide the evidence of her crime in the most dehumanizing way. For investigators and the public alike, the image of a toddler shut away in a suitcase became symbolic of betrayal at its deepest level. The police faced an enormous challenge in piecing together the crime because by the time Dean's body was recovered, it had already begun to decompose. Forensic experts worked painstakingly to establish the cause of death and confirm Rachel's involvement. Her confession provided a direct link, but forensic evidence added weight to the charges and painted a clear timeline of her actions. The case was as much about scientific reconstruction as it was about human testimony. Every detail mattered, every bruise, every fiber of clothing, every trace found in the suitcase. It all told the silent story of what had happened. As investigators pressed forward, the focus turned to the broader failures that had allowed Dean to remain in Rachel's care. Relatives later revealed that there had been growing concerns for his welfare. Reports suggested that Child Protection Services had been aware of Rachel's struggles, yet Dean was never permanently removed from her custody. For many, this was not simply a crime committed by one mother but also a failure by the systems designed to prevent such tragedies. Dean's death became a rallying point for discussions about whether the government and its agencies had the resources, the vigilance, and the will to protect children at risk. In the community, grief transformed into anger. Vigils and memorials became spaces not only for mourning Dean but also for demanding accountability. People carried photographs of the toddler, candles, and stuffed animals, transforming public spaces into shrines of remembrance. His father, Jason, stood among them, devastated and broken. Jason had always wanted to be more present in Dean's life, but distance and custody decisions had kept him on the sidelines. His loss was compounded by a painful awareness that he might have provided the safer home Dean needed. Jason's grief was raw, visible in his trembling words as he described his love for his son and his anguish over being unable to protect him. Meanwhile, the media coverage intensified. Newspapers carried haunting headlines, often accompanied by photographs of Dean as a smiling, innocent toddler. Television news programs replayed footage of the pond, the suitcase, and the police investigation, etching the imagery into the public memory. The narrative was framed as not just a singular tragedy but as a warning about the fragility of childhood and the responsibility society holds toward its youngest members. For weeks, the story dominated headlines, ensuring that Dean's name was spoken in households across Australia. When the case reached the courtroom, it became a stage for painful revelations. Prosecutors laid out the sequence of events with unflinching detail. The moment Rachel strangled her son, the decision to place him in a suitcase, the journey to the pond, and the final act of discarding him. They emphasized the cruelty and senselessness of the crime, arguing that it was a deliberate betrayal of the most sacred bond between parent and child. Rachel's defense team attempted to mitigate the charges by highlighting her troubled background. They spoke of her struggles with addiction, her unstable relationships, her mental health issues, and the immense pressure of raising young children without adequate support. They asked the court to see her as a woman overwhelmed rather than as a cold-blooded killer. But for many observers, the details of the crime left little room for sympathy. Rachel's difficulties in life were undeniable, but they did not explain away the act of strangling a toddler and treating his body with such disregard. The courtroom became a space where compassion for her struggles clashed with outrage at her actions. Members of Dean's extended family attended the hearings, their grief written across their faces, as they listened to every detail, forced to relive the tragedy in clinical, legal language. The trial also revealed information about Rachel's other children. They had been placed in protective care following Dean's death, and social workers testified about the dangers of the environment she had created. It became clear that Dean's death had saved his siblings from a potentially similar fate, though that knowledge offered little comfort to those mourning him. The tragedy underscored how vulnerable children can become invisible casualties of adult dysfunction until it is too late. Outside the courtroom, debates raged about systemic reform. Politicians, journalists, and advocacy groups called for stronger child protection policies, more proactive interventions, and better support for families in crisis. Dean's name was invoked in parliamentary discussions and in advocacy campaigns, ensuring that his death was not just remembered as a personal tragedy but as a catalyst for potential change. Yet for many, such discussions felt hollow compared to the simple truth that a little boy was gone, and no policy reform could bring him back. Rachel herself remained a polarizing figure. To some, she was a monster who had committed the unforgivable. To others, she was a deeply damaged woman who had failed in the worst possible way. Her demeanor in court, sometimes detached, sometimes emotional, only added to the complexity of how she was perceived. The court, however, had to look past perception and focus on the evidence. And the evidence was undeniable. She had killed her son. By the time the prosecution and defense rested their cases, there was little doubt about the outcome. The central question was not whether Rachel was guilty, but what sentence would adequately reflect the severity of her crime. The judge weighed her personal struggles against the brutality of her actions, acknowledging the tragic circumstances of her life, but emphasizing the greater tragedy of a child robbed of his future. As Part 2 closes, the trial loomed toward its conclusion, with Rachel awaiting sentencing and a nation bracing itself for the final judgment. For Dean's family, no sentence could fill the void left by his absence. For the public, no legal outcome could erase the haunting image of a suitcase floating on a pond. And for child protection advocates, the case had already become a stark reminder of the cost of inaction. What remained was the court's decision, the weight of justice, and the lingering question of whether society could truly learn from the loss of a little boy who should have been safe in his mother's arms. The sentencing of Rachel Pfitzner marked the final stage of a case that had already seared itself into Australia's collective memory. When the judge delivered the verdict in 2009, the courtroom was silent except for the words that echoed with the weight of finality. Rachel was to serve a minimum of 25 years in prison, with a maximum of 33 years, for the murder of her son, Dean Shillingsworth. The judgment acknowledged the hardships in Rachel's life, but made it clear that those struggles could never excuse the brutality of her crime. The killing of a child, especially by his own mother, was described as horrific, senseless, and an unforgivable betrayal of trust. The court's decision was not just a punishment but a message to society, affirming the sanctity of childhood and the duty of protection owed to every child. For Dean's family, the sentence was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Jason Shillingsworth, Dean's father, wept as he listened, his grief still raw 2 years after the discovery of his son's body. No number of years behind bars could bring back the boy he had loved, the boy he had longed to care for. Relatives stood alongside him, mourning not just Dean's death but the life he should have had, the milestones he never reached, the birthdays never celebrated, the laughter that was silenced. For them, justice was necessary, but it was also incomplete. The emptiness left by Dean's absence could never be filled. The wider public responded with a similar duality of emotions. On one hand, there was satisfaction that the justice system had acted decisively, imposing a sentence that reflected the severity of the crime. On the other, there was the lingering anger and grief that no sentence could erase. Vigils continued to be held in Dean's memory, with communities lighting candles, laying flowers, and keeping his name alive in prayers and speeches. He became more than a victim of one mother's violence. He became a symbol of innocence stolen and a rallying point for those demanding stronger protections for children. The media coverage did not fade quickly. Even after the sentencing, the story of Dean's murder was revisited in documentaries, newspaper retrospectives, and televised specials. Each retelling brought back the harrowing details. The suitcase floating in the pond, the confession of a troubled mother, the courtroom tears of a grieving father. But these retellings also served a larger purpose. They forced society to remember, to confront uncomfortable truths, and to question whether enough had been done to prevent such tragedies in the future. Dean's case became a permanent marker in Australia's history of child protection failures, a reference point whenever new reforms were debated. Child protection services, heavily criticized during the trial, faced renewed scrutiny in the years that followed. Officials admitted that warning signs had been missed. Reports had been made, concerns raised, but action had been inconsistent and insufficient. Inquiries were launched into how the system could have intervened earlier, and though reforms were introduced, critics argued that bureaucracy and underfunding continued to leave vulnerable children at risk. For those who had marched in Dean's memory, promises of reform were necessary but bittersweet, for they came too late to save him. Rachel's imprisonment meant that her other children grew up in foster and protective care, spared from the dangerous environment that had claimed their brother's life. Their futures, however, were marked by the shadow of what had happened. They carried with them the knowledge of their mother's crime, the stigma of being associated with a notorious case, and the lifelong absence of their sibling. In this sense, Dean's murder rippled outward, shaping the lives of those who survived, even as they struggled to build something resembling normalcy. For Jason, life after the sentencing was a long journey through grief. He often spoke publicly about his son, describing him as a beautiful boy who deserved far better than the fate he suffered. Jason's words were not only those of a father mourning his child, but also of a man demanding that no other parent experience the same loss. He became a quiet but persistent voice in the national conversation about child safety, his personal tragedy lending weight to calls for systemic change. His grief was deeply personal, yet he allowed it to become part of a broader movement to protect others. As the years passed, Dean's story remained present in Australian memory, not fading into obscurity as some tragedies do. His name continued to surface in discussions of child welfare, invoked as a reminder of what happens when warnings go unheeded. Community groups organized annual remembrances, and Aboriginal communities in particular held cultural ceremonies to honor him, integrating his memory into collective rituals of grief and healing. In these spaces, Dean was remembered not only for how he died but for who he was. A small boy with a future that should have stretched ahead of him, filled with love and possibility. Documentaries and investigative reports revisited the case, often focusing on the systemic failures as much as the crime itself. Experts in child psychology, social work, and law spoke about the lessons that needed to be learned. The importance of early intervention, the need for better support for struggling parents, the dangers of bureaucratic delays. Each time Dean's case was discussed, it reignited debates about how society treats its most vulnerable members. For many, the suitcase in the pond remained an image they could never forget, a haunting reminder of what happens when a child slips through the cracks. Rachel, locked away in prison, faded from the public eye over time. Occasionally, reports surfaced about her behavior behind bars or her potential eligibility for parole decades in the future. But for most Australians, she was remembered only as the woman who had killed her son. Her name became synonymous with betrayal, while Dean's became a symbol of innocence. The contrast between them, between the mother who destroyed and the child who was destroyed, was etched into the public consciousness as a lasting moral lesson. In the years following the case, society continued to grapple with the uncomfortable truth it revealed: that love, safety, and protection are not guaranteed even from those closest to us. Dean's death forced a reckoning with assumptions about family, exposing how fragile those bonds can be when overshadowed by dysfunction, addiction, and despair. It was a story that did not allow for easy closure. Even with Rachel behind bars, the emotional weight of the case lingered, carried by the family, the community, and the nation at large. As the final chapter of Dean's story settled into history, one truth remained unshakable. The tragedy of his death was not only in how he died but in how preventable it might have been. The warnings had been there, the opportunities for intervention present, yet none of it had been enough. His case became a permanent call to vigilance, a reminder that protecting children requires not only love from their families, but also vigilance from society and accountability from institutions. In the end, the memory of Dean Shillingsworth lives on as both a wound and a lesson. His life, though brief, forced an entire nation to look at itself, to confront its failures, and to promise, however imperfectly, that it would try to do better. For those who lit candles in his memory, who placed toys at the site of the pond, who whispered prayers for his spirit, Dean is not forgotten. His name continues to stand as a symbol of innocence and as a plea to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And though his story ends in tragedy, it is carried forward in every effort to make sure no child endures the same fate again. A 5-year-old boy, betrayed by those sworn to protect him, wasted away in silence while an entire system looked the other way. His heartbreaking death exposed unthinkable cruelty and shocking failures. This is not just a crime story. It's a wake-up call you cannot ignore. In the heart of Toronto, in November 2002, the tragic story of 5-year-old Jeffrey Baldwin came to light, a story that would forever be remembered as one of the most haunting failures of Canada's child welfare system. To understand the depth of this tragedy, It is important to look at Jeffrey's beginnings and how he came to be placed in the custody of people who were meant to protect him but instead became the architects of his suffering. Jeffrey was born in January 1997, a fragile little boy who entered a world already marked by instability. His biological parents were struggling with their own histories of abuse, neglect, and dysfunction. Authorities quickly deemed them unfit to provide a safe home for their children, and the task of ensuring the children's safety fell to the Children's Aid Society, an organization responsible for protecting vulnerable minors in Ontario. Like many cases before and after, the Society's decision would have consequences more far-reaching than anyone anticipated. Instead of being placed in foster care or with carefully vetted relatives, Jeffrey and some of his siblings were given over to his maternal grandparents, Elva Bottineau and Norman Kidman. On the surface, this may have seemed like a reasonable option. Kinship placements, where children are entrusted to relatives, are often viewed as less disruptive and more comforting than placing them with strangers. Family ties can sometimes offer stability, love, and familiarity. But in this case, the very foundation of that decision was rotten. Both Elva and Norman had extensive histories with child protection services. Elva had once lost custody of her own children because of abuse, and Norman, her common-law partner, carried his own troubling record. These were individuals known to the system, people who had proven in the past to be unfit caregivers. Yet somehow, their past was overlooked, and they were entrusted with the care of Jeffrey and his siblings. Life inside their East York home was far from what anyone would imagine for children who were supposed to be rescued from neglect. To the outside world, the house seemed like any other modest residence in the neighborhood. Behind closed doors, however, the environment became a prison for Jeffrey. While his siblings were treated with some semblance of normalcy, Jeffrey was singled out for cruelty. This was not neglect born of ignorance or poverty, it was targeted, deliberate abuse. Jeffrey was confined to a small, unheated room that became both his bedroom and his prison cell. The room itself reflected his suffering. Filthy, cold, and devoid of comfort. Day after day, he was locked away, deprived of the nourishment every child needs to grow and thrive. While his siblings ate meals and played, Jeffrey was denied food and companionship. His grandparents, who should have been his protectors, withheld basic necessities from him as a form of punishment and control. By the age of 5, Jeffrey had become so malnourished that his body resembled that of a toddler. He weighed just 21 pounds, far below what was normal for a child his age. His tiny frame and sunken features were physical evidence of years of systematic deprivation. Those who later studied his case would remark that his condition could not have been overlooked by anyone who saw him regularly. He was visibly wasting away, his body frail and weak, his childhood robbed from him before it had the chance to fully begin. The selective nature of the abuse made the situation even more sinister. Jeffrey's siblings were not subjected to the same level of cruelty. They were better fed, better clothed, and not confined in the way Jeffrey was. To them, Jeffrey became the shadow in the house, the brother who was always kept apart. Witnesses later testified that Jeffrey would try to climb the stairs, desperate to be part of the family, but he would collapse from exhaustion and weakness before reaching the top. His suffering was not hidden in some distant corner of the city. It was happening under the noses of those who lived with him every day. This raises a haunting question. How could a child in such visible distress slip through the cracks of a system designed to protect him? Part of the answer lies in the failures of oversight. Once Jeffrey and his siblings were placed in the custody of their grandparents, the checks and balances that should have monitored their care fell away. Caseworkers did not properly follow up, background checks were not rigorously enforced, and the Children's Aid Society missed opportunity after opportunity to intervene. The decision to entrust Jeffrey to Elva and Norman was not just a lapse in judgment. It was emblematic of larger systemic issues in child protection practices at the time. As Jeffrey's condition worsened, the secrecy within the household deepened. Elva and Norman's control over him became absolute. He had no voice, no advocate, no escape. At an age when most children are learning to read, exploring their imaginations, and forming friendships, Jeffrey was locked away in squalor, starved of not only food but also affection and human connection. His isolation became complete, and his suffering invisible to those who might have intervened. The tragedy of Jeffrey Baldwin cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the broader environment of child protection in Ontario during that period. The Children's Aid Society, burdened with heavy caseloads and sometimes underfunded, operated within a system where decisions often prioritized expedience over thorough investigation. The placement with grandparents may have been seen as the path of least resistance, a way to quickly resolve a custody issue without considering the deeper implications. But Jeffrey's story would expose the catastrophic cost of such shortcuts. Even before his death, warning signs were present. Family members and neighbors would later admit that Jeffrey seemed small, frail, and withdrawn. But in the world of child protection, unless a formal complaint is made or clear evidence of harm is presented, intervention is rare. Jeffrey lived and died in a silent tragedy, his suffering concealed behind the facade of family life. By the fall of 2002, Jeffrey's health had deteriorated beyond recovery. His body could no longer endure the relentless starvation and cold confinement. Just weeks before his 6th birthday, he succumbed to the abuse that had defined his short existence. When paramedics and investigators finally entered the home, they were confronted with a sight that would remain seared into their memories. A child so emaciated that he appeared skeletal, weighing less than a toddler, a stark contrast to the age he should have been thriving in. The death of Jeffrey Baldwin was not just another child fatality in the city of Toronto. It was a symbol of how systems meant to protect children can fail in the most devastating ways. His story, when it reached the public, would send shockwaves across Canada, igniting debates about accountability, systemic reform, and the responsibilities of both caregivers and the state. But before those conversations could happen, there first needed to be an investigation into how Jeffrey had been allowed to waste away in a house where he was supposed to be safe. Part 1 of Jeffrey's story lays bare the foundation of his tragedy. A vulnerable child, unfit parents, a rushed decision by authorities, and grandparents who became tormentors instead of guardians. It is the story of how a young boy was condemned not by a single moment of violence but by years of systematic neglect, inflicted by those who should have offered him love. It is also the story of a system blind to warning signs, a system that placed him directly into the hands of his abusers. This beginning, though devastating, was only the start of a case that would eventually expose the depth of cruelty Jeffrey endured and the systemic cracks that allowed it to happen. The death of Jeffrey Baldwin on November 30, 2002, was not sudden or unforeseen. It was the inevitable outcome of years of relentless cruelty and neglect. By the time emergency responders arrived at the East York home where he lived, the boy's body bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged starvation. But the story of how Jeffrey reached that point reveals the depth of the torment he endured and the disturbing methods used by those entrusted with his care. Inside the modest home of Elva Bottineau and Norman Kidman, there were two realities. For Jeffrey's siblings, life was not idyllic, but it was tolerable. They had meals, clothing, and relative freedom to move about the house. For Jeffrey, however, existence became a cycle of punishment, deprivation, and isolation. He was not simply neglected. He was singled out, treated as though his very presence was offensive. It was as if Elva and Norman had decided to erase him from the family, reducing him to a shadow locked away in his room. The room that Jeffrey was confined to was described later in court as filthy, cold, and uninhabitable for a child. There was no comfort, no toys, no warmth, no sign of care. The unheated space left him vulnerable to the harsh Canadian winters, and his frail body, already weakened by hunger, had little ability to withstand the cold. Witnesses would later recall the conditions as a cage within a home, a prison cell for a boy who should have been outside playing in the snow or learning how to read. Food, the most basic human need, became a weapon used against Jeffrey. While his siblings sat down to meals, Jeffrey was deliberately denied sustenance. Elva and Norman imposed starvation as discipline, but the cruelty went beyond punishment. They controlled every aspect of his existence by withholding nourishment until his body withered. Over time, Jeffrey's frame shrank, his bones became visible beneath his skin, and his energy faded. His attempts to seek food, to crawl toward scraps, or to sneak a morsel were punished harshly, further reinforcing his status as an outcast within the household. There was evidence that the abuse extended beyond physical deprivation. Jeffrey was also emotionally isolated. Children thrive on affection, reassurance, and connection, but Jeffrey was denied those essentials. He was not embraced as a grandson. He was treated as a burden. When he tried to join in with the rest of the children, he was pushed back into solitude. When he showed signs of weakness or hunger, instead of receiving comfort, he was met with disdain. The cruelty was calculated, not a product of desperation or poverty but of choice. By the year 2002, Jeffrey's condition had deteriorated so severely that his suffering was visible to anyone who looked at him. His tiny body weighed only 21 pounds, the average weight of a toddler less than half his age. He had no reserves of fat, no healthy muscle. His skin hung loosely from his bones, his face hollow and drawn. Yet no one intervened. The Children's Aid Society, which had the responsibility of monitoring his well-being, failed to follow up with rigorous checks. Family members, though aware of tension within the home, did not recognize or did not act upon the extent of the abuse. The final days of Jeffrey's life were marked by silence and decline. His energy drained, he could no longer climb stairs without collapsing. Witnesses described how he would attempt to reach the top step but fall backward, too weak to continue. These images, later presented in court, painted a devastating picture of a child who had been robbed of his vitality and left to fade away in plain sight. In the weeks before his death, Jeffrey's body was shutting down. Malnutrition weakened his immune system, leaving him vulnerable to infections and unable to fight back. His frail condition made even the simplest tasks impossible. On the morning of his death, November 30th, 2002, Jeffrey's body could no longer endure the deprivation. When Elva Boudinot finally sought medical attention, it was far too late. Paramedics were summoned, but they were confronted with a child whose body had been consumed by starvation. Their accounts later revealed the horror of what they found. A boy so emaciated that he looked more like a skeleton than a 5-year-old child. The weight of just 21 pounds was shocking, a physical testament to years of neglect. Attempts to revive him failed. Jeffrey was pronounced dead, and with that, the grim truth of his life began to unravel. The discovery of Jeffrey's condition left first responders shaken. Paramedics and hospital staff were horrified by the boy's appearance, struggling to comprehend how such suffering could have gone unnoticed. The police investigation that followed quickly turned toward the grandparents who had been his custodians. Their accounts of Jeffrey's health and behavior failed to align with the obvious evidence of prolonged starvation. There were no sudden illnesses, no accidents that could explain his frail body. The explanation was far simpler and far more chilling: deliberate and systematic neglect. As detectives began piecing together Jeffrey's final months, the picture that emerged was one of targeted cruelty. Testimonies from his siblings and others revealed the disparity in treatment within the household. While the other children were fed and cared for, Jeffrey was isolated and denied. It was not a household struggling equally. It was a calculated singling out of one child. Investigators soon uncovered the prior histories of both Elva Boudinot and Norman Kidman with Child Protection Services. Histories that should have disqualified them from ever being entrusted with Jeffrey's care. Yet those warnings had been ignored or overlooked, allowing the abuse to flourish unchecked. News of Jeffrey's death began to spread, first locally and then across the nation. The details were almost too horrifying to believe. A child starved to death in one of Canada's largest cities, not in secrecy or hidden away in some remote area, but within a family home under the watch of a system designed to prevent such tragedies. The public, upon hearing the details, reacted with outrage and grief. How could a child, already removed from unfit parents, die in the care of grandparents who were supposed to offer stability? How could the Children's Aid Society have failed to identify the danger? As the investigation deepened, the role of Elva and Norman became clearer. They had not simply been negligent. They had actively perpetuated the conditions that killed Jeffrey. They locked him away, denied him food, and treated him as less than human. Their defense, when questioned, attempted to frame Jeffrey as difficult or unruly, but these claims were shattered by the obvious reality. a boy cannot waste away to the size of a toddler without sustained abuse. The evidence was irrefutable. The conclusion of Part 2 in Jeffrey's story is the moment when his death transitioned from a private tragedy to a public case, when the suffering hidden behind the doors of his grandparents' home became exposed. It was a turning point that forced the community, the authorities, and the nation to confront the devastating consequences of systemic negligence and personal cruelty. As investigators prepared charges and the legal system began to move, Jeffrey's short life became the centerpiece of a trial that would not only determine accountability for his death, but also expose the deeper flaws of a system that had failed him so completely. The trial of Elva Bottino and Norman Kidman in 2006 became more than a legal proceeding. It was a window into the unimaginable suffering endured by Jeffrey Baldwin and a reckoning with the failures of a child protection system that had entrusted him to the very people who caused his death. Courtroom testimony and evidence forced the public to confront the harsh reality of Jeffrey's life, transforming his story from a private family tragedy into a national conversation about accountability, responsibility, and reform. Prosecutors laid out the grim details of Jeffrey's final years in painstaking detail. They described how the 5-year-old boy, weighing just 21 pounds, was confined in a filthy, unheated room, denied food, and isolated from his siblings. They demonstrated that the conditions he endured were not accidental but the result of intentional and sustained actions by his grandparents. Medical experts testified that Jeffrey's death was caused by severe malnutrition and neglect, conditions that developed over years and could not have gone unnoticed by his caregivers. Every fact, every photograph, and every statement presented in court illustrated the same chilling conclusion. Jeffrey's death was preventable, and it was the direct result of cruelty. The defense attempted to portray Elva and Norman as overwhelmed caregivers, struggling under difficult circumstances, but the argument fell flat. The selective nature of Jeffrey's abuse was undeniable. His siblings, while not raised in luxury, were fed, clothed, and allowed a semblance of normalcy. Only Jeffrey was locked away and starved. This disparity stripped away any notion of unintentional neglect. It was deliberate targeting, and the court recognized it as such. The jury listened to testimony from experts and family members, as well as emotional accounts from investigators who had discovered Jeffrey's body. Their descriptions of his frail condition shocked even seasoned professionals. One of the most striking aspects of the trial was the revelation of Elva and Norman's past. Both had long histories with child protection services, histories that included abuse and prior involvement with authorities. The fact that they were able to gain custody of Jeffrey and his siblings despite this record exposed glaring systemic flaws. The Children's Aid Society had failed to conduct proper background checks, a failure that the trial highlighted repeatedly. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with grief and outrage. For many observers, it was impossible to reconcile how such a tragedy could have occurred in a city as developed and resourceful as Toronto. The trial stretched over weeks, with evidence mounting against the grandparents. Ultimately, in 2006, Elva Bottino and Norman Kidman were convicted of second-degree murder. The verdict confirmed what the evidence had shown all along. Jeffrey had not died of natural causes or parental incompetence, but because of the intentional cruelty of the two people who should have been his protectors. The convictions brought some measure of justice, but they could not erase the suffering Jeffrey endured. His death had already become a symbol of the devastating consequences of systemic oversight. In the wake of the trial, public pressure mounted for answers. How had the Children's Aid Society placed Jeffrey in the custody of individuals with known histories of abuse? Why had there been no follow-up to ensure the children's safety? These questions led to further inquiries, culminating in a coroner's inquest years later that examined the systemic failures surrounding Jeffrey's death. The inquest revealed troubling details about the lack of communication and accountability within Ontario's child welfare system. It showed that Elva and Norman's past convictions and records had not been properly reviewed before custody was granted. It highlighted the gaps in information sharing between agencies and the absence of rigorous monitoring once children were placed in kinship care. These findings made it clear that Jeffrey's case was not just the result of individual cruelty, but also of institutional negligence. Public outrage over the case was profound. Citizens across Canada demanded reforms to ensure that no child would suffer as Jeffrey had. Advocates called for stricter vetting of kinship caregivers, better oversight, and stronger accountability within child protection agencies. Jeffrey's story became a rallying point for change, a reminder of what happens when the most vulnerable members of society are overlooked. To him, in 2014, a bronze statue of Jeffrey dressed as Superman was unveiled in Toronto. Superman had been his favorite character, a symbol of strength and heroism that Jeffrey had admired but never had the chance to embody. The statue, created after a campaign by community members and child advocates, stood not only as a tribute to Jeffrey's life but also as a reminder of the responsibility society holds toward its children. The image of a small boy in a superhero costume became a powerful symbol of both tragedy and resilience. Jeffrey's story also continued to influence discussions about child protection in Canada long after the verdict. His name was invoked in debates about reforms, training for social workers, and the allocation of resources for vulnerable children. His life, though short and marked by suffering, became the catalyst for change, pushing institutions and individuals to confront uncomfortable truths about negligence and accountability. In reflecting on the legacy of Jeffrey Baldwin, it becomes clear that his story is not just about one child or one family. It is about the broader failures of a system meant to safeguard children. It is about the responsibility of institutions to act with diligence and care. It is about the role of communities in noticing, reporting, and intervening when a child is in distress. And it is about the devastating consequences when these responsibilities are neglected. The trial and subsequent inquest forced Ontario, and indeed all of Canada, to look closely at its child protection system. While reforms have been made, the memory of Jeffrey's suffering continues to serve as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that behind every case file is a child, a life that depends on adults making the right decisions. Jeffrey's fate underscores the stakes of those decisions and the irreversible damage that can occur when the system fails. As the final chapter of Jeffrey Baldwin's story, the courtroom verdict closed the legal proceedings, but it opened a broader dialogue that continues to this day. The bronze statue of Jeffrey as Superman stands not only as a memorial but also as a promise. A promise that his life, though marked by unimaginable suffering, will not be forgotten, and that his death will not be in vain. His story remains etched in the conscience of a nation, urging constant vigilance to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, Jeffrey's tragedy is a stark reminder of both the cruelty that can exist within families and the danger of complacency within systems meant to safeguard children. His legacy, however, is one of awareness and reform. Through public outrage, legal accountability, and symbolic memorials, Jeffrey Baldwin's story continues to echo, ensuring that the little boy who once dreamed of being Superman will forever stand as a symbol for every child who deserves love, safety, and protection.